Every time election season is upon us, we can be rest assured that there'll be a ton of neoliberal and neoconservative politicians to come out the woodworks to tell us how tough on crime they will be if they are to be elected. Naturally, one of the crimes that they will promise to be so tough on is theft. There is, however, one type of theft that I've never seen mentioned in a flyer or a campaign poster or anywhere else. And no, I'm not talking about taxes or even wage theft in a commonly used term. Those are interesting things to talk about, but I'm not talking about them today. The type of theft that I'm talking about today is far greater and far more sinister in a way than those types of theft. You see, taxation, you can see how much you're owed, and even wage theft, that is, bosses not paying overtime or not paying minimum wage, are calculatable by the average worker. But the type of theft that I'm talking about is more sinister, because not only does it count for more money, it's even bragged about. It is so ubiquitous that it's not even seen as theft anymore. But today I will argue that it is theft. The type of theft that I'm talking about is surplus labor value extraction. How do we calculate the value of something? Like, where does value come from? Why is a coat more valuable than a bag of wool? Or why is a bag of wool more valuable than an unshaven sheep? The 19th century German philosopher Karl Marx gives his insight in what he called the theory of labor value. This theory states that the value of a thing, or a commodity as he called it, is produced by the labor that has been put in to produce it. So, a diamond is worth more than a pebble because you need a lot more labor, you need a lot more work to get a diamond than it is to get a pebble. Now, it's important to note that value in this does not immediately equal price. They are two separate things, and there are other tangents as well. I'm not going to get into them too much, but just a few that are commonly interjected into this. One is the idea of a mud pie, that being labor doesn't necessarily equate value just because you put labor into something. Like baking a mud pie doesn't make it valuable. It needs use value as well. And it assumes the average worker labor. So even if someone is very fast at working, it doesn't necessarily mean that the commodity they produce is less valuable because there's less labor into it. But it's more nuanced than that. But for the sake of this video, that'll be enough of an understanding to get what I'm going for. Let us now look at a modern day business and the production process within. We take a company that produces, let's say, widgets. It buys raw materials and uses machines and skilled labor to produce an end product that consumers will then buy. We can represent the production process within this business with the following formula. M to C prime to M prime. We start with M. This stands for money. Starting capital, if you will. How this capital is acquired we shall get to shortly. Next comes C. This stands for commodity. These are the starting commodities of the production process. Think of the raw materials needed for the production of the widget, but also the upkeep to the machines and the labor necessary for each production cycle. These commodities are what Marx called the means of production. Next comes C prime. This is the commodity that is being produced. In our example, this would be the widget the factory makes. Important to note here is that this widget is worth more than the sum of its parts. It has increased in value. This commodity of C prime is then sold for money once again. Only this amount of money, M prime, is more than the amount of money, M, that we started with. This M prime might then be used as a starting capital for another production process, starting the whole cycle again. Only this time, the initial input is more, as M prime is greater than M. Thus, M prime is turned into an even greater amount of money at the end of the production cycle. This is the purpose of production under capitalism. It is not to satisfy human need, but to satisfy human greed. Any for-profit company has at its heart only one goal, and that is to produce profit for its shareholders. You might be wondering at this point where the difference in value comes from. How come that C prime, or the commodity that comes out, is more valuable than the sum of its parts? Is it not true that in the formula, the things you put in must equal the things you put out? If the input is one amount, say 125 of some unit, must the outcome not also be 125? How come it can be sold for 200? And that is where profit comes in. Let's take the example that we used of the widget factory to analyze this further. We start with a starting capital. Let us imagine the current owner of the widget factory gained this factory as a matter of inheritance. They then used the money they gained from this inheritance to hire workers and buy the raw materials that are needed for the production process. Let's say that per widget, $50 of raw materials are required and 5 hours of the average worker's labor. The owner decides to put the wage of these workers at $10 an hour. Of course, the machines that are used in this process, along with the use of electricity, but also the cost of marketing, accounting, etc., should be taken into account in this calculation. So we shall put that as $25 per widget for the sake of this argument. That means each widget's cost is $50 plus $10 times 5 hours plus $25 equals $125. The owner does not want to sell the widget for $125, however, as this would not produce any profit. As profit is the entire goal of this operation, the owner decides to sell the widget for $200. Now we have arrived at the question that lies at the heart of anti-capitalist thinking. To whom belong the spoils? Who does this extra or surplus $75 belong to? In the current system, that is capitalism, this surplus belongs to the owner in the form of profit. This is often justified by the idea that the owner brought in the starting capital. They brought the M, so they should be entitled to the M prime. But is this a justifiable reason? I believe this notion falls apart when we consider three things. The first thing to consider is how the owner came to have the capital that they needed to start the business in the first place. In the example we just looked at, we used inheritance, which isn't an uncommon way for the owning class to get their start. But is this a justifiable way of acquiring capital? Not only that, but does it justify taking the lion's share of value not created by you yourself, but instead created by the workers? If all owner had to do to get a portion of the value a laborer has created is to be born to the right family and to get a right inheritance, then in what way is capitalism really different from feudalism? The second thing to consider is that oftentimes the starting capital for a production process is gained through a previous production cycle. As we previously discussed, M prime is often reinvested as M. But if that's the case, how could that ever justify the owner taking the surplus? If the initial production cycle extracted M prime in an unjustified manner, how could that ever justify the owner taking the surplus in the next production cycle? At this point, we are talking in circles. Production cycle B is justified because they brought in money, but they made their money through production cycle A. Well, how did they justify the profit from production cycle A? For the third point, let us consider the hypothetical ideal self-made entrepreneur. Someone who worked their entire life very hard, gained money, bought machines, and set up a production cycle that way. Made their starting capital by the fruits of their own labor. Even in this hypothetical, how does that justify taking the value from other workers? And if it is true that one can gain a position where they can justifiably extract parts of the value of the labor that others produce because they made the initial starting capital themselves, where does this power end? Is a slave owner justified in owning those slaves and extracting the value from their labor because they made the money to buy them and to feed them themselves with their own labor? Of course not. So how can the position of power and taking the profit produced by those workers ever be justified even if they made the starting capital with the fruits of their own labor? The capitalist, of course, makes a distinction between slavery and the current wage labor system, because the idea is that wage labor is voluntary. Of course, the workers don't have a choice not to work. You have to work to get money to pay rent, food, feed your kids, clothe yourself. The workers don't have a choice not to work. In this case, the only difference between capitalism and feudalism is that in capitalism, people can choose their master. The owning class makes its money through owning things, which it uses to own more things to make more wealth ad infinitum. But we say that that wealth does not belong to them. They did not put in the labor to produce that value. The workers did. And so the spoils of that labor belong to those who produced it, the workers. In 2020, American corporations made a total of more than $2 trillion in profit. Money produced by the working class, stolen from them and given to the owning class under the guise of profit. We say that this belongs to them. But this theft is so ingrained in our society that we don't even recognize it as theft anymore. So what's the alternative? How can workers regain their stolen value? Well, there are many alternatives, but one of them that's the easiest to implement right now is that of worker co-ops. Companies that are owned by the workers and in which all workers are owners. These companies can still function relatively similar to how current capitalist companies are run. They might still be run by a board of directors, which is elected by the shareholders. They might still have managers and may even have some sort of CEO. The only difference being that the shareholders will not be Wall Street billionaires. They will be the workers. And as such, the profits will go to the shareholders, the workers who created the value. And this is another benefit, that of democracy. Currently, companies are run as virtual autocracies, run by the owning class, and if you are a worker, you don't have any say in what your labor does. You are told what to do, how to do it, and when to do it. And you better put a smile on it when you do it. But with a worker co-op, the workers are the ones in charge. They elect the managers, so the managers have to adhere to the will of the workers. If they are too oppressive, the workers could vote for a different manager. We have a democracy in our politics because we believe it to be the best way for politicians to adhere to the will of the people. So why don't we have them in the places where we spend most of our time? I'm not saying that worker co-ops will solve all the problems that we have due to capitalism. A communist revolution will still be necessary, but it will be a great leap forwards. And it will at the very least be very tough on the crime of the theft of surplus labor value.